That's the thing about bikini armor. Now, people complain a lot about bikini armor, but it does what it says. It will protect your bikini. Your bikini will be safe. Another question I got from Kirsty Shanks was about writing relationships in a way that makes them feel natural. I am not a relationship expert, and maybe not the best person to be talking about this. But I can talk a little bit, at least, about what seems to feel natural to me when I'm observing relationships in the stories. Because I have noticed in films and television, although mostly film, that some relationships feel much more realistic than others. And I think one of the big factors as far as a relationship feeling natural is just time. When you've got a story that's a one-off, it's harder to make relationships feel believable or like they're starting in the right context. Unless the relationship is the entire story. And when you've got a story that is mostly about other things, like an adventure story, or a spy story, and there just happens to be a love story happening in and amongst all of that, but it's not actually the main focus. One movie tends to be too short of a time for the characters to have the opportunity to get to know each other to the point that the audience feels like those two characters will actually be able to make it work. It can happen. You have to be very good at it. So one of the first things that comes to mind for me when it comes to writing relationships more naturally is just time. Just allow the characters to have enough time to be able to form their relationships naturally. That's easier to do, I guess, if you're doing a series, like either an episodic series or just something that works as like part of a trilogy. You don't necessarily need to have all the right characters falling in love in the first story. You can save some of it for later. As far as making the relationships more relatable for your audience, I think giving a greater amount of time to have the relationships build naturally is one of the ways to go for that. Love at first sight does happen. That is a thing that can happen in real life. But it is not exclusively how it works. It depends on the individuals and their particular love story. It sounds weird, but I think that romance gets romanticized in storytelling. Like, over-romanticized, and that we've been funneled into thinking that love has to work this one very specific way, and that one very specific way is generally love at first sight. Just because that's like 90% of what we see in stories. But in real life, it works out a number of different ways. Sometimes it is that slow realization over a number of years of, oh, you. Okay, I am okay with that. Or preferably, I am very happy about that. Not just okay. Kind of want your characters to be more excited than that. Personally, if it's a question of what relationships are more believable to survive the trials that always come with the relationships, it would be the ones in which the characters have seen each other through difficult times already. Which generally is part of the story. If you're doing a relatively epic story.
So it falls to me to put you down. Typical.
And it doesn't have to.
I have to do everything else around here.
Yeah, I think there's studies that have shown that a shared ordeal is one way of building relationships. So that is something that would be quite natural to work that in if you've got characters who are on an adventure together and they experience ordeals together. Then it would be scientifically proven to work. I don't know that that necessarily feels natural. I think that depends on your audience. Because shared ordeals seem like maybe not the best things to base a relationship on, and that's why it can't be the only thing. But it can be an initial catalyst. The relationships that are most secure are the ones in which both people have seen the worst of each other, or at least seen each other's dark sides, and like faced them, recognized them, see them, and decided that they still love them. Because everybody has the stuff that they're not proud of. Everybody has flaws. That is something that you have to write into your characters if you want the relationships to be natural, is you do have to acknowledge flaws in order for characters to be realistic and relatable. It's the relationships where not just the couple has been through difficult times, but they've also seen how each other can be difficult. And they've still looked at each other and gone, no, I love you. I still want to be with you. Those are the relationships that, in my mind, are the most likely to make it. So if you can find ways of incorporating that into your story, your readers will probably come away with more of a sense that those characters are going to be okay. That they're going to make it as a couple. That would be my take on that. Once I started getting serious about fantasy writing, I realized that I had so many different stories in mind. I was coming up with a lot of stories that were different in nature and had different rules as far as how different species would work. Because there isn't always a general consensus to lean on with certain things. Like, for example, orcs. There's at least two common and dominant versions of orcs. And with each story I was taking the approach of deciding the rules for everything from scratch, and I realized that that was going to be a lot of work, starting from the beginning with everything. So I decided to simplify it, simplify the process by making one fantasy world that incorporated all of the fantasy elements that I felt I might want to use in different worlds and different stories, and used that as a template to build other fantasy worlds off of. There's even a common mythos. And originally, this world that I was making included elements from even individual worlds like Dungeons and Dragons, Lord of the Rings, including stuff that was very IP, like not stuff that was public domain. Stuff that belonged to particular companies. And would be very much copyright protected were I to ever try to use them. But once I had spent enough time building up this one world, I realized that I'd put too much work into it just to use it as a template. I should actually use it for one of my own stories. So I removed or altered everything that wasn't public domain, so that I can make it all usable. And that took quite a bit of research, looking up all these different species. Because there's a lot of things that you would automatically think are public domain, just because of how frequently you see them or something like them in a variety of works. But they are actually things where either the creature itself or usually just its name, like Balrog and Ent, is something that belongs to a particular company. But you can have fire demons and tree people in your stories, absolutely. You just can't use the same names. One particular thing I had to change, which was late in the game, because it came across as a surprise, was I had named a bunch of characters and places and species using Tolkien's Elvish, because I thought that was public domain. Because I've definitely seen names in different worlds in video games or films, and I'm pretty good at inventing names using languages or combinations of languages. So I'm pretty good at either researching names or figuring out meanings through etymology, and finding common related meanings in similar sounding names. I made the mistake of making an assumption instead of actually doing the research before naming all of these characters of mine using Tolkien's languages, and then found out that it's not public domain yet. And so I had to invent my own Elvish. I definitely used Tolkien's style as inspiration. And so for the mythological characters and place names in this grand fantasy world that eventually became Val Arden, which is the world I use in Chronomancer. A lot of the names had to be either changed entirely, or I had to change the meaning of the names and the way that the names break down. Because some of the people that were running into legal trouble were people that were providing translations of Tolkien's Elvish online. Because the translations themselves are something that belongs to the Tolkien estate. Or at least that is my particular understanding of the situation, so like don't take that as straightforward legal advice, just in case I'm wrong about that. But I am playing it safe by not using Tolkien's Elvish. Whenever I'm not quite sure what I can get away with legally, I will tend to err on the side of caution. The process of inventing my own Elvish actually turned out to be a blessing for the most part. Because some of the names that I had come up with because it was very important to me to have a certain meaning, I didn't necessarily like how they sounded. So that gave me the opportunity to redo those names. Something that sounded better to me. Also, a note, just in case anybody listening to me didn't already know this. It's not just one Elvish language that Tolkien had. And there was a specific reason of why he made the difference, why he made the distinction between the two, but I could never quite get a firm grip on what that distinction was. So I just always combined the two in my head, but that's not the proper version. The proper version is the two distinct languages. Take on that. When I was putting together my own fantasy world, yeah, I prefer Tolkien's version of orcs compared to the more Skyrim and Warcraft types. But one thing that I never quite understood about Tolkien's lore with orcs is their origins. I understand them having some connection with elves, but being descended from elves never quite sat right with me. At least when you look at the amount of animosity that exists between the two groups. And even in Lord of the Rings they talk about it. How the orcs were, like, they originated as elves who were captured and tortured. And then that experience turned them into these things. Because, yeah, if the original orcs, and potentially all the ones that descended from them as well, are essentially elves, but are only the way that they are because of, like, torture and mutilation, then the emotion that I would expect elves to feel toward them would be one of remorse, not so much the disgust and hatred that they seem to feel for them. But it is possible that the way that that animosity is portrayed in the films is not quite accurate to what Tolkien envisioned when he wrote the books. That is a possibility. But I'm guessing that the reason that Tolkien made orcs to be a fallen version of elves is because he almost equates elves with angels. I think in terms of hierarchy, it puts them somewhere between human and angel. So I'm guessing that he also wanted to equate orcs with the demons to an extent by having them be a fallen version. So I think I understand Tolkien's reason for there being a connection between elves and orcs. But when it came to designing my own world and my own lore, I did want to do something different as far as what that connection is. And I wanted to come up with something that better fit the brand of animosity that I tend to feel between these two groups. So what I decided on was not that the orcs are descended from the elves. Exactly, because even if there's some change and adaptation that occurs as a result of being raised in a much darker place. When I think of elves, there is an automatic sense of dignity that I get from them that I don't think would go away to such an extent that they would become orcs, the way that I picture orcs. So what I ended up going with for my version of orcs was that they were created by a biomancer, which is a fantasy way of saying bioengineering, who used the life script of the elves and made certain modifications in an attempt to create the ultimate slave race, which is what eventually became the orcs. And the life script is just a fantasy way of saying genetic code. I have to come up with fantasy terminology for things that originate as science fiction concepts in order to keep it within the fantasy realm. So if I start saying things like bioengineering, then even though that is technically what's going on, it pulls the audience out of the fantasy genre, because the term is associated with science fiction. One thing I have to be careful of when writing in a particular genre is not bringing up things that the audience would normally associate with a separate genre. It's the same reason why, unfortunately, you can't have dinosaurs in fantasy, at least not using the same names. If you have a creature that's described exactly the same as a particular dinosaur but have a different name for it, then you're okay. But if you're writing fantasy, then you can't use the technical terms like Velociraptor or Pterodactyl, because they are sciencey sounding names. And also because about 99% of the time that dinosaurs are in something, in a story, they are there because of either time travel or cloning, both of which are primarily science fiction concepts, unless you come up with magical explanations for how they're happening. which you very much can do. If you're just creative with your names. I figure by having the orcs be genetically based off of elves, but with alterations, mainly that have to do with removing certain traits, it creates the right context for the elves feeling like the orcs exist as a kind of mockery of them. As like a way of saying, but for a few pieces of information, this is what you are. And it also gives the orcs a reason to despise the elves as being supposedly better built or more complete. If orcs are basically the same thing but with a bit of information missing. And also a reason for a unified sense of pride against the elves. As to say, well, we were designed this way by a guy who was trying to create the ultimate race. Therefore, we are perfect. We are the ones who are perfect and you are not. And create a sense of competition between the two. Hey, made it to the end of the video. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to leave a like, leave a comment to let me know what you think, and subscribe to stay notified about future content. Until next time, thanks again for watching. I hope you're all staying safe. I'll see you later.